Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. We still have people logging on, but by the time we get through our preliminaries, hopefully everyone will be here. This is Terry Behrens, the Foundation Review, and this is our quarterly Foundation Review webinar. This one is a little different than some of our past ones. I see some familiar names, people who've been on our webinars in the past. This time we have 3 different authors presenting, so they've been given the challenge of trying to summarize their articles very briefly. We will be, I'll be turning over to them in just a minute, but first I want to go through a few housekeeping items. First of all, if you experience any technical glitches during the webinar, please contact the ReadyTalk helpline, the numbers on your screen there, or email help@readytalk.com. And they typically are very helpful if we run into any issues. The phone lines are muted at this point. We will use chat to communicate with the host, which is me, or with our presenters. You should see a chat screen on your screen there as a participant. If you don't, try moving your cursor to the top of your screen and it should appear. So you can send in your questions at any time and we will periodically be stopping to address those questions. The webinar is being recorded and we will send a link along with copies of the slides to all registered participants. Okay, with that I am now going to turn it over to Susan Batten. So we've been delighted to have the opportunity to co-edit this issue with Susan and her team from ABFE, especially Erica Davies, who worked very hard with me on this issue. I think that this topic of racial equity is just critically important to the future of our society, really, and the way these 3 foundations are preparing themselves to engage more effectively in racial equity work, I think is instructive for all of us. Susan, do you want to take it from here?
Great. Thank you, Terry. Thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. We really appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with the Johnson Center and the Foundation Review to present this program today. It's an appropriate next step to the Review's journal on racial equity grant making, of which we had the opportunity to co-edit. I hope you all had a chance to see that full journal. It's amazing work going on in the field and some very important writing. For those of you who do not know us, our mission at ABFE is to promote effective and responsive philanthropy for Black communities. So the issues and practice of racial equity grant making is at the core of what we do. Prior to coming to ABFE, I actually was at the Annie Casey Foundation and had the job to help lead that foundation's work on racial equity. So I know how important the peer conversations are in the field. They've always been very important to me. We wanted to partner with the Foundation Review on this journal because we know that there are leaders in the field moving this work, and it's so important to uplift these stories. We're just one organization that's trying to do so. There are other organizations in the field that are doing this as well, namely the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity. And more of us can and should be conduits for sharing these stories and lessons learned. And it's important for the field to know that this work is what I call doable, that foundations that take on strengthening their investments for all people, that they have more guidance, more direction, and more peers in the field. So co-editing the journal was another great opportunity for us to get these stories out, and this webinar today is just another great opportunity and step. So I am going to jump right in. I have the opportunity to moderate for the program today, and I'll just take you through the agenda that's posted here for you. This is our welcome. We really have, as Terry said, the opportunity for 3 colleagues in the field to share their stories and their work around racial equity grant making in 3 very different foundations, which makes this really interesting. And on the call with us today is Lori Bezahler, the president of the Edward Hazen Foundation, Christopher King, who is the immediate past board chair of the Consumer Health Foundation, and Carrie Pickett-Erway, the president of the Kalamazoo Community Foundation. And we'll follow the agenda as listed here. The colleagues have about 6 minutes to present, as Terry said, their amazing work that showed up in the journal. And then we'll move to some questions from myself before we open it up to the audience for Q&A. And I understand we've got about 48 or so people registered. I'm really hoping that you will engage, that you'll encourage us, and that we really nudge each other on moving this work forward. So again, just to put names with faces, here are our colleagues today. We're going to take the presentations in this order with Lori, with Christopher following Lori, and then Carrie will wrap us up. So with that, I'm going to turn to Lori, who is with the Edward Hazen Foundation. I'm just happy to say, as my neighbor takes the mic, that the Hazen Foundation received APPE's 2013 Institutional Award for Philanthropic Leadership. And we give that award to a foundation every year because of the work they do on issues of race and equity. And so proud, again, Lori, to be able to introduce you in that way. And I'll pass it to you now.
Thanks, Susan. I will say, just by way of apology, it was absolutely quiet here until about 2 minutes ago, and then I started hearing sirens and drilling next door, so I will do my best to overcome that, but I apologize for background noise. So the Edward Hazen Foundation is a national foundation. It was established in 1925 by the Hazens, and their intent was to provide resources and develop initiatives to support the development of young people, and they specifically spoke to on young people that lacked social advantages in the parlance of the time. Rather than going line through a paper in 6 minutes, I wanted to give you an idea of why I chose to write this article and sort of what I wanted to learn by going through Hazen's history in this way, and maybe then you might even want to read it. So basically, I was interested in answering the question, how did an institution with leadership that looked pretty much like this become an institution with leadership that looks like this? And what difference does that make? So I think it's important that we understand that Hazen's story. Oh, I'm going to pick up the phone off of speaker. They're drilling. I apologize. Hello. So we have to understand, that Hazen's story is one of a conscious effort to create an organization reflecting its articulated values. Beginning in the 1970s, the Foundation's leadership took great pains to bring onto the board individuals that would do more than just check boxes in terms of diversity, but they were looking for people who would challenge privilege and power. And so their goal was really full inclusion as we understand it now, rather than what we might think of as simply diversity. And so they found people like Jean Fairfax, who was a lawyer with the NAACP, and Manuel Guerrero, who was a Chicano activist at the time. And as you can see from these quotes, they brought with them a force of personality and personal experience and a deep political analysis. They had an ethos of ideas about justice and self-determination, and that started to permeate the culture of the foundation. But we know that simply diversifying leadership does not generally or always lead to different ways of approaching grant making and the work of institutions, and there's been some interesting data recently that's come out about that. But I identified what I thought were three critical factors that might have to do with why Hazen does the work it does today and the way that it does. So the first was diversifying leadership, critically important to the ends that we're looking for. As they say, necessary but not sufficient perhaps. And as I noted above, they were committed to having a fully inclusive board, but they also were interested in diversifying the staff. And so in 1988, Sharon King was hired as the Foundation's first African-American president. In fact, the three most recent presidents at the Foundation have all been women, and two of the three women of color. Another factor is the way that Hazen thinks about data. So since the 70s and 80s, the Foundation started to ask prospective grantees for demographic data on constituency, board, and staff. And rather than filing it away, it became an active part of the grant-making decision process. The board gets the demographic data to this day for all prospective grantees and has always raised questions when it's not reflective of the constituency that they're seeking to serve. And they have even denied grants over the years to organizations, not just that didn't reflect that, but that didn't respond in a positive way to the notion of taking steps or thinking differently about how to be more reflective and inclusive. And then the third piece is having grantees on the board. I think that's really also changed the dynamic in how decisions are understood and how the work in the field is understood. So the whole composition of the board also shifted from one where there were, individuals who might be considered the representative to one where there was really a tipping point, I think. And there isn't a sense of tokenization anymore, but rather a sort of collective sensibility about how to think about race and to respect across all the different experiences that are represented on the board. So what difference does this make to what the foundation actually does? In terms of the grant-making practices, there's been a steadfast commitment to that original intent. But the trustees have really understood that it evolves in response to contemporary circumstances. Increasingly, the foundation has a focus on structural rather than individual change and collective action as a methodology for change. Archon Fung, who's a social theorist, I think provides an interesting quote about how we understand democratic practice and collective action here. And we also you think about the underlying values of democratic participation and self-determination as a way that young people come to organize and understand their world and understand their personal lived experiences in the context of structural inequity, and then come together to take collective action. And so we do support young people in organizing and in institutions that use the methodology of organizing to address structural oppression and to move towards racial justice. And Sean Ginwright and Taj James have done some really excellent work looking at the work of these organizations. And I think this quote also gives you a little bit of an insight into how Hazen thinks about that work. So in the article, I talk about how this has affected our grant-making activities with two particular examples. One of them is an example that has to do with a community confronting an issue of hard-to-staff schools where there's high degrees of teacher turnover and low retention. The other example that I talk about is the issue of punitive school discipline policies that drive students out of school. And there's been a great deal of public attention recently. The Civil Rights Project at UCLA estimates that over 2 million students were suspended in the 2009-2010 school year, and we know that there are significant negative consequences to suspensions. A student who's been suspended has a 32% chance of dropping out of school. That compares to only about a 16% chance of a student who hasn't been suspended, so it doubles their chance. And we also know that these discipline practices disproportionately impact students of color. The rate of suspensions for Black and Latino students has more than doubled since the 1970s. Today, nearly a quarter of all Black students and a third of Black male students are suspended from secondary school, and that compares to only about 8.4% for white students. So the racial consequences, implications are enormous. Hazen grantees have been pushing back on these policies on zero tolerance and other punitive practices that compose the school-to-prison pipeline for 15 to 20 years. The quote here from a student leader that I met in 2005 is, I think, quite eloquent on the subject. He said, "There are 4 tracks in our school: college track, and we're not on that; military track, low-wage work track, and penitentiary track." Young people were very clear on what their experience in schools were, and they were creating language to describe that, language like the school-to-prison pipeline. We see that language and their analysis is being taken up at all levels of government, and the quote from Eric Holder from a recent speech uses their language and lifts up their experience. I know from the work that we do at Hazen that without those years of young people raising their voices and building power to be heard, this issue would not be at the forefront of public policy. Kavita Medorata, who's a program executive at Atlantic Philanthropies and has done a great deal of work in this area, documented that observation, speaking to officials at all levels of government who acknowledged the critical importance of young people's voices in moving this issue. I truly believe that Hazen's emphasis on self-determination and collective action and practice of providing sustained support for organizations that define and articulate problems in communities of color and provide young people with opportunities to build collective power and give voice to their lived experiences and a structure to do that work has made the difference in moving this issue. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lori. Thank you. Amazing work. We're going to pause for a minute here, and we'll do so after each presenter, just to see if there are some clarifying questions for Lori specifically. We'll have a discussion later in the Q&A portion of the program, but we just want to give folks an opportunity, if they have a clarifying question, to ask Lori, and you can send it in to the chat line. And I understand, Terry, you'll let us know if you've got any
Lori
questions
should be able
for Lori.
to see them too. So it does not look like there are any questions coming in, so I think we can probably move along.
Great.
I do encourage the speakers to speak loudly and preferably not use a speakerphone.
Okay, great. Okay, we're going to move on to Christopher King with the Consumer Health Foundation. Christopher, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Susan. I want to thank you also, Terry, for making this webinar possible, and I'm so pleased to be on a panel with such esteemed leaders in this space. I do want to reiterate that I was the chair of the Consumer Health Foundation when this article was written. I co-authored it, and Unique Redwood, our president and CEO, served as the lead author. So I'm glad that the decision was made to have a board member actually be a part of this conversation. Let me advance to the next slide here. All right. So let me begin by providing a brief overview of the Consumer Health Foundation. While our racial equity work is nationally recognized, we are a small private foundation that serves the Washington, D.C. metropolitan region. The foundation has its roots in the Group Health Association, which was a cooperative HMO that started in the 1930s to provide prepaid health care to members in a racially integrated environment. And today, we use the profits from the sale of Group Health Association to invest in advocacy with a focus on access to care and health justice. When the foundation was created in 1998, our approach was to increase access to care by funding efforts around increasing the number of or expanding the capacity of safety net providers. However, as the work of the foundation continued to evolve, we began to realize that our approach was more reactive, and it didn't address the root causes of poor health in communities of color, causes that go way beyond the availability of healthcare providers. So we had to step back and ask ourselves a question. Do we want to fund emergency services at the back end, or do we want to be a foundation that's focused on being proactive and addressing upstream factors that contribute to racial and ethnic disparities in health status and health outcomes? So needless to say, our strategy has been redirected to focus on education, living wages, safe and affordable housing, workforce development, and food equity. We envision a region and a nation in which everybody has access to equal opportunity to live a healthy and dignified life. And even though we're in the heart of our nation's capital, the relevance of our vision becomes even more pronounced as there's incredible wealth that is juxtaposed with deep pockets of poverty, primarily among people of color. And a number of studies have documented these differences in quality of life and life expectancy at the neighborhood level within our region.
Christopher, I'm sorry for interrupting, but I'm getting a request for you to please speak louder.
Oh, speak louder. Okay.
Yes.
All right. In recognition of these trends, we got really serious about explicitly addressing structural racism in the late 2000s. Defined as public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and how other types of norms work in various and often reinforcing ways that perpetuate racial group inequity. Structural racism is inextricably linked to health status. Therefore, we view racial equity as a process, one that is ongoing, and we really wanted to focus on that in the paper, and hopefully that was clear. And as a result, the board and staff engage in routine education and assessment on subject matter and findings that help inform our strategic planning. The Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity and the Applied Research Center have been especially helpful for us. The board is also committed to having members who are racially and ethnically diverse and who mirror the populations that we're targeting. So we've developed a board member matrix that helps us see board member composition by race and ethnicity. It also helps us ensure that we have the right mix of skills and talents that will advance our work. And at the staff level, we recruit for new positions using communication outlets that attract qualified candidates from communities of color. We do so when recruiting business partners. We do the same when we're recruiting business partners and hiring vendors, for example, when it comes to catering and marketing. And we're in the process of exploring how to use these types of measures as equity indicators for measuring performance at both the CEO and the staff level. In our work, we believe the goal of racial equity relies on our grant-making strategy, capacity building, strategic communications, strategic partnerships, and mission-consistent investing. We are a learning organization, and we talk about that quite a bit when we have our board meetings, and we recognize that taking risk and getting out of our comfort zone is absolutely paramount to stimulating change. And as I mentioned earlier, our grant-making strategy transitioned from supporting safety net providers to advocacy organizations that are focused on an array of interconnected issues, including community development, budget and policy analyses, as well as health care reform and language access. 35 out of our 51 grantees are explicit about working with communities of color. Let me also add that as part of our grant application, like we just heard from our other speaker, we do ask applicants to provide us with data on the diversity of their boards and senior leadership. It's our hope that these types of questions will prompt awareness on the importance of the issue. And while grant making is a big part of our work, we also recognize that as a foundation, we can be very influential in stimulating change. We believe that building a shared understanding, commitment, and language, consistent language around diversity, inclusion, and racial equity in our larger community is critical if we're going to succeed in changing policies and systems. Therefore, we help strengthen the capacity of our grantees by providing racial equity training. We also provide media training for grantees to help them communicate this priority to a broader audience. And we've done the same with our own strategic communications. So I'm not going to go into depth with specific examples, but they can be found on our website, consumerhealthfoundation.org. Another example of how our work goes beyond grant making is our annual meeting, which is open to grantees and key partners. We do this once a year, and this past year we had, we had social justice advocate John Powell from the University of Berkeley Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society, and Carly Beth Hawkins with Project Implicit. And Brian Smedley also joined us from the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. We're very strategic about our business partnerships as they allow us to be more impactful in our work. This includes pooling resources with other grant-making organizations whose missions may not be directly linked to health, but the end goal addresses an issue that is a health correlate. Examples can also be found in the article. Mission-consistent investment means that all investments and the decisions that we make are guided by our values. Approximately 35% of our endowment is invested in mission-consistent vehicles. This means investing using local and minority-managed funds. We bank with a community development financial institution, and we make program-related investments, which generate a below-market rate of return while advancing specific program-related goals. Collectively, we believe these strategies will result in policy and practice change at the systems level. We also believe our contributions will help people of color become better organized with the capacity to affect change. And through our work with our grantees and even those who strive to be our grant partners, we believe our contributions will help them have more diverse leadership with greater emphasis on racial equity. And through our strategic partnerships and peer networking and collaboration, we believe our work can increase access and awareness of racial equity concepts and practices. And finally, we think this approach helps to contribute more investment in local communities of color. As I close out, you may be wondering, how do we measure all this? How do we know that we're moving the needle? And are there any successes in which we can give ourselves direct credit for accomplishing? Well, these are conversations we have at the board level quite frequently, and it's not easy to take direct credit for major milestones, for example, the ACA. We were very involved in work to help make that happen, but obviously we can't take credit solely for that accomplishment. But we do track our time and the energy that we spend on these initiatives. We track new policies, practices, and other accomplishments that come to fruition that we've supported. We also track racial equity accomplishments of our grantees, and we continue to look for ways to track progress. However, my personal position has always been our work is paving the way for much-needed conversations around structural racism and implicit bias. And since we are a foundation, we're free from the political nuances and restraints which offer us an advantage in serving as a convener for robust discussions that bring people and organizations together that typically do not talk or sit in the same room. We also provide formal and informal racial equity consultation with other grantees who are struggling with moving to the next level, whatever it may be for their organization. So yeah, we're really excited about the work that we do. We believe in taking risk, and we do know that through these conversations, change is occurring. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Christopher. I'm looking forward to the Q&A conversation, and glad you did mention the importance of having a board member on today's call, because the theme around board responsibility, I think, connects all of the speakers today on the call. So I'm going to just pause for a minute. If anyone has any clarifying questions for Christopher, you can send them in now. And Terry, you can give me the flag. If not, we can move on to Carrie.
Okay, not seeing any come in.
Great. Okay. Carrie, you want to wrap us up and talk a little bit about the experience at Kalamazoo Community Foundation?
I'd be happy to. Thank you, everyone who's calling in, and thank you to the Foundation Review for including us in this very important conversation. And the story that we're going to share is a little different, and hopefully adds even more to the complexity of the work in front of us. As a community foundation, we have multiple stakeholders to engage with, including our grantees, but also donors to the Kalamazoo Community Foundation. And much of the story that I'll share in just a few minutes is about our learning journey and some of the difficult conversations that surfaced around our good intentions and how we went about that, but what we learned from that and how we addressed some of what we were discovering. So first I'll start with some of our major milestones, and the first one being a diversity policy that the board adopted in 2000, so we're into our 13th year of that policy, and this was really a statement of our beliefs, and it was intended for the Kalamazoo Community Foundation to really push us into the walking of the talk. Our organization has a great history in really pushing the edges of inclusion and diversity, but this policy was very bold, and it helped us to think about how do we, as an institution and as a community leader, really demonstrate this commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in it, the statement says that we believe that diversity encompasses but is not limited to, and then we provide a full list of characteristics, and included in that are race, ethnicity, gender identity, and sexual orientation. And some of the characteristics that were selected to be listed were very progressive in the year 2000. At that time, listing both gender identity and sexual orientation was something that we didn't see in a lot of other diversity and inclusion policies. So shortly after that policy that the board adopted, we launched a fundraising and grant-making initiative around the LGBT community, which further tested some of our own competencies in reaching out to diverse stakeholders in our community and really helped us identify some of the training and development needs of our organization, our staff, our volunteers, our board, and some of our key community stakeholders. And then a few years later, we continued to do some work with a local partner around anti-racism efforts, and we fully recognized that anti-racism efforts were unique, they were different, and they were important, and that they should not be bundled in with general diversity efforts. And it was at that point that our board really felt the need to adopt a resolution claiming an anti-racist identity. And a lot of the language that I'll reference today is in the article in the Foundation Review, but it's also available on our website at calfound.org. And you can see the language that our board and our leadership chose to try to articulate our position on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So as we were continuing all of these efforts, we started to use a tool internally called the Intercultural Development Inventory. And this was a tool that was introduced to us as we were part of a peer action learning network hosted by the Council of Michigan Foundations. And this tool helped us to conduct an assessment with all of our staff and helped us to measure our cultural competency within developmental stages. And that allowed us to understand that when we were engaging colleague to colleague, we weren't all coming from the same place. Thinking of cultural competency as a combination of your own lived experiences, but also the skills and the development that you have engaged in as an individual to continue to evolve your worldview and your ability to meet people where they are. So these were all really important tools for us in thinking about how we could be effective community leaders and grant makers with our external community stakeholders. And as we were progressing on this journey, our work around anti-racism, anti-bias, our work around the LGBT inclusion efforts, and our work just in general around cultural competency, we experienced some unintended consequences. And it really reflected an ambitious and bold beginning when we articulated a position that we were hoping we and our community could achieve with full inclusion at every level. And part of the complexity that we discovered was that in our diversity policy, while we said diversity means all of these things, in order to receive a grant from discretionary resources, nonprofit agencies needed to sign an inclusion statement that committed to full inclusion at every level of their organization. And what we realized was that there were some organizations for whom that was very complex, faith-based organizations in particular. So as we asked our grantees to really commit to full inclusion in all the clients that they served, that was relatively easy. Most of our nonprofits had no problem, and in fact that was part of their mission. But when we talked about full inclusion in all volunteer roles, including the board, and in all staffing positions, including the senior position, for faith-based organizations that became difficult. For many of those faith-based organizations, their organizational structure might be dictated by national or international guidelines. For example, the Catholic Church would have difficulty inviting people of other faith traditions to truly apply for the senior religious leader position in their organization. So we really had an opportunity to step back and think about the intent of our policy, wanting to see full inclusion, wanting to see the cultural competency of our own organization and those we fund evolve and grow over time. And we felt like our policies perhaps were creating boundaries that were getting in the way of the important conversations that we wanted to have about growth and development and what was best for our community. This was all information that surfaced through internal feedback. And so what we discovered through some conversations we were having at the staff level was that we didn't all understand the intent behind the policy or the application of the policy and the inclusion statement in the same way. And right when these conversations started to surface, we went through a CEO change. And so this was a great opportunity for us to step back and really re-engage our board in a conversation about what they were trying to accomplish with these bold statements, and why did they say what they said, so that we could, as a staff, better articulate the intention behind this and engage our community in thoughtful conversations. And so as we continue with this effort, we discovered, and Christopher mentioned it specifically, but I hear it in all the presentations, this commitment to being a learning organization is key to helping us better understand how our policies, our practices, our procedures impact the work that we do at the Community Foundation. So we have a process now where we do an evaluation after every cycle, whether it's a grant cycle or a gift cycle or a board meeting, to help us really explore how we can do things even better, honoring the original intention of that work. We also discovered through this process that engaging the Foundation's leadership is absolutely critical to moving the work forward. Some early conversations and questions that were raised, I think, were prematurely dismissed because they were perceived as just not understanding the complexity of the issue. And when we dug a little deeper, we realized that the board itself didn't fully understand where everyone was on these particular issues about inclusion and what unintended consequences can surface when you require everything for everyone. And it allowed us to really open dialogue with our community partners. Since this work has unfolded and our policy and our positions have evolved, we've had a lot of conversations with grantees and donors. And so one-on-one conversations, small group conversations, we put information out into our newsletters and on our website, and we communicate as often as we can. But most importantly, we're soliciting feedback from those community partners to better understand how our work is impacting their ability to continue and progress on this journey. And with that, I will wrap up and turn it back to the presenters.
Great, Carrie. Thank you so much. I know more folks than just myself appreciate the candor around unintended consequence, because we all experience that in this work. So thank you to all three of you. We're going to jump into conversation mode, and I understand we've got some good questions coming in. I'm just going to start by posing a question to each one of you, and then we'll open it up for the audience to ask questions themselves. So I'm going to go in the order that we had the presentations in, and so Lori, I'm coming to you first. And you mentioned it in your comments today, but clearly I picked this up in reading the full article that's in the journal. You mentioned that, and I quote, Hazen's internal practices include a commitment to patient, sustained support for grassroots organizations that develop the capacity of young people, end quote. Lori, I am struck by the frame of patient support and a competency or a skill that we often don't find in foundations who are very focused on impact and return on investment. And so if you could talk a little bit about how the foundation defines short-term progress along the way while managing the critical process work of organizing and building power among youth of color. If you could just talk a little bit about that.
Sure. It's obviously a really complex question, and I think I noticed that somebody asked about evaluation also in one of the questions that's coming through on the chat. So I think it really starts with your definition of outcome, right? Your understanding of your goal and having short-term indicators and markers along the way as moving towards that are critically important. So, Hazen has adopted a mission statement that's extremely visionary. I would say it's about supporting youth and communities of color and dismantling structural oppression based on race and class. And, you're not going to do that in a 3-year grant cycle. It's just, that's not going to happen. So you need to understand that what it means to take steps towards that are important. So I'll give you a very concrete example in the funding that we're doing right now. We made a 4-year commitment to a set of grassroots organizations, and we selected them to be along a continuum in terms of their work on structural oppression and race. And they all had to have an articulated sensibility that aligned with the foundations, but they also had to understand that this was going to be a time of learning and moving forward, because we really wanted to get organizations to move past understanding how race works in the lives of young people based on disparate outcomes, and more to understand the structural racialized policies that underlie their lives and the world in which they live. So that's a really big step forward. And so what we've done is we're providing technical assistance and support and capacity building for them with some providers that we're working with. But we have a set of criteria that we understand, it has to do with how they articulate race, both internally and in materials. We look at their website, how are they talking about it? We look at their campaign demands, at their literature, at the kind of materials they produce, as well as how members in the organization, because these are membership organizations, it's not just how does staff talk about race, but how is that being communicated into the broader membership as ways for everybody to be able to lift it up and have an analysis. So, what I guess I'm getting at is that a step, a measurable indicator of progress, is how they articulate race internally and externally. And then you can move towards how do they understand policy matters in relation to that analysis, and then what changes do they see. So those are all steps. And I just want to just flag one thing that, I think when we in philanthropy define that for them, I truly believe we are undermining the potential of people to determine their own future and their lives, and therefore to address issues of deep inequity and social injustice.
I really appreciate that, Lori. Thank you. And time and time again, we're in meetings in the field, and I hear colleagues struggle with how to demonstrate progress when they're doing the important but slower work in community organizing to move policy in this country. So I think more we can lift up those examples that you just gave us, the better we'd be. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm going to move to Christopher. And Christopher, thanks for laying out the theory, the very clear theory of the Consumer Health Foundation and how you all are working through it. You mentioned that the foundation is a regional foundation, but you've been nationally recognized for this work. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Sure, I'll be happy to. We always look for opportunities to share our story, and we work very closely with grant makers in health. And through grant makers in health, we've been able to reach out to other foundations, again, that are on different places on the continuum as far as pushing this agenda forward. And so we've been recognized by the grant makers in health, of the National Committee of Responsive Philanthropy, did a 2011 report on that included some of our work, and in 2009, the Applied Research Center for Philanthropic Initiative and Racial Equity produced Catalytic Change, in which some of our work was featured. But when we come together, we go to our annual meetings through the Grantmakers in Health, it's really interesting for us because we are able to see that, you know, we have a lot of work to do. There's so much more progress that needs to be made, and to have conversations and to help board members and staff that are still struggling with how do you move this, how do you do this work? And I see some of the questions coming in around pushback and how do you address pushback? Well, yes, we definitely have pushback, but we at Consumer Health have a board that is committed to being explicit about this work. It's just integrated in who we are. It's in the fabric of what we do. And because of that, you know, we've been able to work with, you know, other foundations across the nation and helping them, you know, move forward. And so that's we look for opportunities to publish our work. We think that's really important. And as we were looking for our new CEO, we wanted to be sure that that she or he had interest in writing and capturing and documenting these lessons. And so this is an example. This piece right here, this paper, this article is an example of how we are going beyond the Washington region to affect change across the nation.
Thank you, and please continue. Please continue to do that because we're learning as you are going through your journey. And one last question, Carrie, I'm going to pose to you. I'm so glad you're on the call, being a community foundation, and you mentioned, you know, you've got a number of stakeholders to work with as it relates to issues of racial equity, grantees, but also donors. And I wanted to probe a little bit there. We are celebrating the 100th year of community philanthropy in this country now. I know all of us are seeing the activities going on. If you could talk a little bit about working with donors more specifically, sort of what have been some of the challenges or the issues that you face specifically as it relates to donor relations and education around racial equity and inclusion, and maybe one or two lessons for the field.
Sure, I'd be happy to, and that is definitely one of the areas that that we've struggled with and have learned a lot from. And I think I would sum it up by saying part of our approach, a big part of our approach, is helping our staff meet the donors where the donor is. So meeting people where they are. Not all of our donors are really interested in having a deep conversation about systemic racism and the issues of white power and privilege. And some of our donors don't have the vocabulary to enter into that conversation in the way that it produces learning and growth. And some of our donors, I think, have perceptions that our work around this and our expectations for our grantees come off heavy-handed. And so we've had to be very thoughtful about how we engage in those conversations. And we have found that we can be more successful when we talk about cultural competency and these efforts around equity and inclusion as a core competency, in the same way that we think about our fiduciary responsibility and our stewardship role in philanthropy. So as we think about how to make deepest impact in our community and solve some deep-rooted social issues, part of our approach really must include an equity lens in order for us to really get any traction. We also find that it's helpful with our donor conversations to use data to talk about the complexity of our community that already exists, talk about some of the disparities, to really help our donors understand why we need to put a focus on these conversations. And the reality is that when you take bold positions with your community leadership, whether it's activities that you're involved in or grant making that you do, you will lose a few long-term friends of the Community Foundation. Likewise, we have found that we have gained some new partners and really engaged with different communities that might never have thought of the Community Foundation as a friendly partner in important work.
Great. I so appreciate that. Thank you. losing and gaining. We often aren't thinking about both sides of the story.
Right.
So with that, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. I think, Terry, you're going to sort of help us group some of the questions. I actually can't see the questions coming in on the chat function for some reason, but I'm going to turn it over to you to help get us through this next phase.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Yes, we have quite a few questions coming in. I'm just going to start working through them in the order they came in, and hopefully we can cover most of them in the time we have left. So the first question was, I'm struggling with how to create a safe place for conversation for people new to this discussion and not comfortable coming into a conversation on racial equity and not feeling as though the discussion is accusatory. So Carrie, I think you just dealt with some of that in how you frame this conversation with donors. Anybody else would like to add anything about creating the space to have this conversation?
Let me add that we did quite a bit. Sometimes the racism and racial, that word can be very, very, it can be, as we're hearing even in this conversation, a bit much for some. And so we've done quite a bit on just implicit bias and just helping people understand how this is so deeply embedded. And using that as the language can help create a more or a deeper conversation, which will eventually elevate, I think, to the direction that we want to really go in. But I think just starting off with just an awareness about bias and how that actually impacts decisions and how policies are actually developed would be something that I'd recommend.
Okay.
Yeah, I would this is Lori, I would just add to that, for the work that we do at Hazen, it's not about personal feelings around race, either conscious, unconscious, implicit bias, although we certainly, do think a lot about how implicit bias acts in our society very strongly. But in terms of starting hard conversations, I think we try to focus on sort of the historical antecedents of current public policy. So what do we know about how we got here at a time when perhaps we can all agree there were, what I would just call bad actors in the picture. So it's got nothing to do with individual intent in a contemporary way, not about you or me or how I feel. But even before that, it's how did we get here? And what are the vestiges that continue to have racialized consequences?
Okay, thank you for that understanding of history.
I just, this is Susan, the good news is that there are great tools out there to do just what Lori said. Race, the Power of an Illusion by California Newsreel is one of those documentaries that actually help people understand the history, and it's a powerful tool. The other thing I would just say is that starting conversations don't have to be big conversations. Really thinking about peers and one-on-one discussions with trusted leaders is another way to go about it.
This is Carrie. I would chime in and add also, I have been successful at starting some conversations using the very statement that's in the question. I'm struggling with how to open this conversation so that it doesn't sound accusatory, and I want to have the most productive conversation possible. Sometimes naming the fear at the beginning of the conversation helps to get it out of the way.
Great.
Okay, great, thanks. Let me get through a couple more questions here. For all presenters, were there any legal issues that you needed to address up front in hiring or grant making when you started to target more affirmatively? Anybody deal with any legal issues?
So there's several factors that we look at when we're considering what a successful grant application would be. We do not make these requirements, but it's very, very clear in all of our documentation that this is important to us. So, and I think I said earlier, for organizations that are interested in being one of our grantees, we're hoping that this work will help affect change, whether there are grantees or not, because they may submit an application that really doesn't demonstrate a commitment to this work, and we always, why get feedback why, and making that clear. I think that's another way that we can affect change. But it's not, we don't say you have to have a certain number of minorities on your board, or we don't make that a requirement for our grantees.
So, and this is Lori again. I want to differentiate hiring and grant-making decisions, or because clearly there are legal ramifications to hiring practices, and we all need to get good advice from good legal counsel on that. So that goes with the standard for hiring for any employer. So that's separate. In terms of grant-making practices, I don't honestly know of any challenges to asking for demographic data from grantees. We certainly haven't encountered any legal challenges to it, nor have any been raised. And I think that there are enough of us out there doing it that I think it's an acceptable practice. In terms of how we use it, again, I haven't encountered any concerns on the legal side. I think it's, as I said, different from employment, and we have to remember that. We do ask grantees to sign a statement of non-discrimination, which we do require in order to release funds to any organization. And that we did get vetted by a lawyer, so we seem to be in the clear.
Okay, great. We only have a couple minutes left. There was one question I thought I would pose and just ask you each to take less than a minute to respond to. So kudos to all three foundations on your progress. Can you each share a bit more about your current or next stage challenge now that you've gotten this far? And why don't we just go around in order again, Lori, Christopher, Carrie, and that will have to conclude our time today.
Well, thanks for the compliments. We feel like, it's always interesting to me because we feel like we're just starting all the time, and yet it's great to hear colleagues that are on the same kind of path. I think in terms of the next challenges, it's critical, I think, to continue to drive towards public policy, which is really what we're concerned with, that reflects the real lived experiences of young people of color and that get at root cause change rather than putting Band-Aids on bad policy in order to try and mitigate the results of bad policy. So to us, that's definitely the challenge, and the biggest part of that challenge is not to be the driver of the bus, but to be on it with our grantees.
Okay, thanks.
I'm sorry, Susan.
No, Christopher. Yeah,
okay.
We were giving it to you.
And for us, I would also just want to put a plug in for the logic model. If you go to our website, consumerhealthfdn.org, we do use a logic model, which also helps us shape our thinking and what's important and how we're measuring progress. Our next step is around establishing equity indicators for staff performance as well as our performance as a board. And so we're having some conversations around what that will look like. So that's our next step.
And Carrie?
We're struggling with the same things I think that the first two presenters talked about, so ditto on all of those. In addition to that, I think that we're struggling to better understand the intersections of some marginalized communities within our geographic area. So, for example, the intersection between faith communities and the LGBT community, faith communities and racial minority communities, different socioeconomic communities, and that when we engage with our stakeholders, they never come just wearing one hat. And being as inclusive as possible and understanding how to build a stronger community in ways that really creates a place for everyone at the table. I think that's our next challenge, in addition to policy and being on the bus but not driving.
Okay, unfortunately that does bring us to the end of our time, so thank you, Carrie, and thank you to Susan for being a wonderful moderator and to all of our speakers. we will be sending, as I said at the beginning, we'll be sending copies of the slides and a link to the recording out to everybody who was registered. We just want to note that if you are not a subscriber, that you can apply the fee to becoming a subscriber. You can email Robert Shallett at the email address you see there. We also have emailed out links to the 2 articles that are open access and a copy of the 3rd article to everyone who was registered for the webinar, and hope that if you have not done so already, you had a chance to read the articles and really get the full depth and of what our authors were talking about today. All right, so that concludes our webinar. Again, thank you, everyone, and we will see you next quarter at our next webinar.